Arrival in North Africa. March 1941, Tripoli, Libya. The sea was endless. Days turned into one long blur of grey, and all we could see was the endless stretch of water. The ship rocked gently, and I felt a strange kind of stillness settle in my chest. It wasn't a calm feeling, more like a sinking one, as if the sea beneath us wanted to pull us down into its depths. We were packed tight in the hold of the ship, my comrades and I, surrounded by the salty stench of sweat and fear. The air was thick with the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. We were bound for a place none of us had ever truly imagined. Africa. The name alone seemed foreign, distant. The heat, the sand, the unknown, everything about it felt like something out of a dream. But dreams don't feel real, and when the orders came we had no choice but to follow them. I was just a boy back then, young, eager, and full of the kind of excitement that comes with the idea of adventure. I had been trained, yes, but not for what was coming. Nothing could have prepared me for the desert. The hours dragged on, the days stretching out like endless lines in the sand. I spent my time staring out at the water, trying to imagine the land we were headed to. The stories the older men told were both strange and terrifying. They spoke of the heat so intense it could burn your skin, of vast stretches of desert where you could get lost and never find your way back. But most of all, they talked of the fighting the British soldiers, the tanks, the planes overhead. I could hear the fear in their voices, even as they tried to hide it. When we finally arrived in Tripoli, it felt like we had been floating forever. The moment we stepped off the ship, the heat hit us like a punch to the face. The air was thick and dry in a way I had never felt before. It sucked the breath right out of you. The sun was a furnace, blinding in its intensity, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the spot. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. Tripoli itself was a place of dust and stone. The streets were narrow and winding, and the buildings seemed to be constantly crumbling under the weight of time and the harshness of the sun. There were men everywhere, soldiers, locals, Italians, and a few of us, the new arrivals. The Italians were already here, holding down the line, but they were tired, worn down from months of fighting. I had only just turned 20, but in that moment, standing on the foreign soil of Libya, I felt older than I ever had before. The heat, the unfamiliar language, the strange faces all round me, it was like being dropped into the middle of a dream, one where I didn't quite belong. Our orders came swiftly. We weren't here to stay long, they told us. Our job was simple: shore up the Italian defences and prepare for whatever the British would throw at us. The desert would be our battlefield, and the Italians, though exhausted, were waiting for us to help push back the British forces. It was supposed to be a quick mission, just a few weeks. But I should have known better. No war is ever quick. We were assigned to the 5th Light Division, a newly formed group under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The name Rommel wasn't one I knew well, but the older soldiers spoke of him with a kind of reverence. The Desert Fox, they called him. They said he had a way of seeing the battlefield, of understanding the desert in a way no one else could. They spoke of him as if he were a man who could make the impossible possible. At that moment I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that we had come to a place that was as much a part of the enemy as it was a part of us. A place where we would fight to stay alive. The first few days passed in a haze of preparation. We were given supplies, ammunition, rations, and equipment we barely had time to familiarize ourselves with. There was no time for comfort. We were soldiers, and the desert was waiting for us. I remember the first time I laid eyes on a tank. It was like something out of a dream, huge, rumbling, with a sense of power that could crush anything in its path. It was a Panzer, sleek and deadly. The tanks were our pride, and they were supposed to be our key to victory. But even as I stared at the gleaming metal, I felt the weight of what we were about to do. We were here to fight not just for survival, but for something bigger, something we hadn't yet fully understood. The days grew longer and the heat became unbearable. The sand seemed to be everywhere on our skin, in our mouths, in our clothes. We moved in a constant haze, our bodies drenched with sweat, our minds focused only on the next step. There was no room for fear, not yet. We were young men in the prime of our lives, eager to prove ourselves. But the desert has a way of humbling you. It doesn't care about your ambition, your courage, your youth. It just is. I recall my first night under the stars. The air had cooled slightly, but it was still a far cry from the chill I had grown used to back home. The sky stretched out above me, an endless expanse of blackness dotted with stars. It was peaceful, almost serene, but beneath that calm I knew the storm was coming. The first attack, the first battle, would come soon, and when it did, we would be ready. As the days passed, we continued to prepare. The anticipation began to gnaw at me. I had no real understanding of what war in the desert meant, not yet. I had heard the stories, seen the newsreels, but it was all distant, abstract. Now I was about to experience it firsthand. In the distance, the British were waiting. They were there, just across the horizon, and they would come for us sooner or later. For now, we trained, we waited, and we tried to ignore the nagging feeling in our gut, the feeling that we were about to step into something that would change us forever. Tripoli, the place that had seemed so foreign and strange when I first arrived, was now home in a way. It was a place of beginnings and endings, of unknowns and certainties. The desert had swallowed us up, and we had no choice but to become part of it. And so the wait continued. But the calm before the storm was growing shorter with every passing day. Chapter 2. The Push East. April 1941, Battle, Libya. The journey eastward was not as I had imagined. The desert, which I thought would be a vast, open sea of nothingness, proved to be something far more oppressive, and yet strangely captivating. Each morning we packed up camp before the first light of dawn, and the heat began to press down on us even before the sun rose high in the sky. It was as if the land itself had been holding its breath all night, waiting for the moment it could consume us once again. We marched for hours, our boots grinding into the fine, shifting sand. The terrain was uneven, unpredictable. One minute we were trundling along flat ground, and the next we were climbing over jagged rocks or sinking into loose sand that seemed to want to swallow us whole. It felt like the earth was conspiring against us, mocking our every step. The men around me were quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Some tried to engage in conversation, but the words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and meaningless. The air itself felt thicker than anything I had experienced before. It was dry, so dry that it almost hurt to breathe. It scraped against my throat like sandpaper, but you couldn't drink too much water. You had to ration it. The desert was a cruel master, and it made sure we knew our place. The closer we got to Baie de Fom, the more the landscape began to change. The pale yellow sands gave way to rocky outcroppings, and in the distance we could make out the dark silhouette of a town. Baie de Fom, we were told, was a strategic location. It sat on the road that led deeper into Libya, a point of defense that the British would fight hard to hold. It was also where we would encounter our first serious push into enemy territory. I had heard stories from the older soldiers about the British. They spoke of their well-coordinated attacks, their superior tactics, and their ability to fight with precision. But none of that seemed real until we saw them with our own eyes. As we neared the town, we set up a defensive position. It was in a rocky area, perfect for hiding tanks and positioning men without being seen. We had no idea how close the British were, but the men whispered about possible reconnaissance, and soon, the tension in the air grew thicker than ever. It was early evening when it started. At first it was a rumble, barely noticeable beneath the usual hum of the desert. Then the ground began to shake. Low, deep, and relentless. At first I thought it was just the wind, the way the desert can play tricks on your senses. But the sound grew louder, closer, until I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was something much worse. A British patrol had spotted us. We didn't know how many, but it didn't matter. The battle had begun. I saw the dust first, rising in clouds on the horizon. The sound of engines roared to life, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The British were here, and they weren't wasting any time. We moved quickly into position, clambering into our panzers, adjusting our helmets, and checking our weapons. The sense of calm that comes with routine kicked in. We had trained for this, and now it was time to act. It wasn't fear that I felt, at least not at first, but something else, something sharper. A kind of electric focus that made everything else fade into the background. The first exchange was a blur, sudden, explosive, and loud. Gunfire erupted from all directions, and the shrill whistle of shells passing overhead made the blood in my veins freeze. I could see the flashes of British artillery in the distance, hear the rumble of their tanks as they charged across the rocky plain. It felt like the world itself had exploded. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp tang of gunpowder. I remember the first time I fired my own weapon, pulling the trigger, watching the rounds streak across the desert, and seeing them slam into the side of a British tank. There was something surreal about it, about watching the metal crack and burst apart. But there was no time to think. We kept firing, our tanks rumbling forward, trying to gain the upper hand. We had the advantage of speed, but the British weren't giving up easily. It felt like every time we gained ground, they countered with twice as much firepower. The rumble of their tanks was relentless, and the crack of their machine guns seemed to come from all sides. There was a moment, just a few hours into the battle, when the world seemed to slow. I remember looking out across the battlefield and seeing the sun, blood-red as it dipped below the horizon. The light cast long shadows over the wreckage of destroyed vehicles, the twisted metal that had once been machines of war. The desert, so still and quiet just days before, was now a hell of fire and noise. I saw men fall. The first time you witness it up close, it's a shock. It doesn't feel real. One moment a comrade is standing beside you, and the next he's gone, his body crumpled to the ground. The sand around him turns dark. The air smells of blood and dust. I didn't know how to process it, but I couldn't dwell on it. Not then. There was no time for grief, only survival. The battle lasted longer than we had anticipated. Hours turned into days, and with each passing moment the intensity of the fighting only grew. Our tanks moved like shadows in the dust, striking, retreating, striking again. The British were relentless, but so were we. We pushed forward, determined to take Battle, to prove that we could win this battle. Chapter 3. The March to Tobruk. May 1941, near Tobruk, Libya. The silence after a battle is never truly silent. Even when the gunfire fades, even when the dust begins to settle, the noise lingers in your mind. The clattering of tank treads, the roar of engines, the sharp crack of distant artillery, it stays with you. It's a hum that never fully goes away, a kind of buzzing in the back of your skull. In the days after our victory at Battle, I had hoped for some kind of respite. But the desert doesn't rest. Neither do the British. We had barely taken a breath before the orders came in: push east, toward Tobruk. The British stronghold there had held firm for months, and it was a key point in the war. If we could break their defences, we would have a clear path deeper into Africa. It was a strategic move, and there would be no hesitation. We began our march under the brutal sun. The convoy stretched for miles, our tanks rumbling over the rocky terrain, the men sweating under their uniforms as the desert heat cooked us from the inside out. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt cool, or the last time I hadn't been thirsty. The dry air seemed to suck the moisture right out of your body, and even when you drank, it never felt like enough. As we moved, I couldn't help but notice how much had changed in such a short time. The men around me were different. There was no laughter anymore. No joking between the lines. The battles, the losses, the endless hours of marching had worn them down. We were no longer just soldiers, we were something else now. We had become ghosts of the men we used to be, drawn forward by duty and the grind of war. We had no illusions about the challenge ahead. Tobruk wasn't just a city on a map, it was a fortress. The British had fortified it for months, and their defences were said to be some of the toughest we would face. The town itself sat on the coast, surrounded by minefields, barbed wire, and heavy artillery. There would be no easy way in. Our first encounter came a few days later. The British had spotted us long before we saw them. It was the same as always, quiet at first. The first sign of their presence was a sudden burst of smoke on the horizon. Then gunfire. At first it was sporadic small arms fire from hidden positions, nothing that could hurt us too much. But it wasn't long before the heavier weapons came into play. The roar of a British artillery shell filled the air, and I watched as it landed just yards from one of our tanks, sending a plume of dust and dirt into the air. The blast reverberated through the ground, and I felt it in my chest. "Brace yourself," one of the crew shouted over the roar of the engines. We were in our tanks, moving fast, trying to find cover as more shells rained down. The ground seemed to shake with each explosion, and I could hear the faint cries of the wounded, the screams of men who had been caught by the blast. But there was no time for hesitation. The tanks pressed forward, our orders clear, advance and break through. We had no choice but to push on, no matter the cost. The British were good, their fire accurate, but we had the advantage of speed, of mobility. As our panzers moved, we returned fire, aiming for anything that could be used to hold us back: anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, anything that posed a threat. The battle raged on, each moment filled with the deafening sound of combat. I remember the first time I saw one of our tanks go down. It wasn't dramatic, not like in the movies, where the explosion sends the whole machine flying into the air. No, it was slow, almost tragic. 1 minute the tank was charging forward, its engine growling with power. The next it was hit. A bright flash of fire erupted from the side of the turret, and the tank spun out of control, crashing to a halt. We all froze for a split second, watching as the crew scrambled to escape, their faces painted with fear and urgency. The tank was lost. The men, thankfully, managed to get out in time. The reality of war had never been clearer to me than in that moment. Tanks were machines. They could be replaced. But men, they were irreplaceable. We didn't have time to dwell on it. The British were relentless. The battle continued, the sound of gunfire punctuating every movement. We fought for hours, moving in waves, pushing through the British defences, inching closer to the city. But no matter how far we advanced, Tobruk still seemed a lifetime away. By the time we reached the outskirts of the town, the sun was setting. The desert stretched endlessly in front of us, the horizon blurring into a golden haze. The heat had become a weight, pressing down on us, making it hard to think, hard to move. My lips were cracked from dehydration, my eyes stung from the dust, but we couldn't stop. We were soldiers, and there was no time for weakness. We dug in for the night, setting up our positions just outside the city. The night air was cooler, but it brought no relief. The tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Every man knew that the worst was still to come. The British would regroup. Their defences would only grow stronger, but we had to push. We had to take Tobruk, no matter the cost. As I lay in the sand, trying to rest my aching body, I couldn't help but think about the men we had lost. The faces of the fallen lingered in my mind, those who had been with us just hours ago, laughing, talking, planning for what would come next. Now they were nothing but memories, faces burned into the back of my mind. I thought of home. I hadn't heard from my family in weeks. The last letter I received was a simple one, filled with words of encouragement and concern. It seemed like a lifetime ago, and yet it felt like it had been only yesterday. I wondered what they would think of me now. I wondered if they would ever know what I had become. Tobruk was just ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a city. It was the edge of something. The line between what we had been and what we were becoming. And as we prepared for the next day, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for a victory in Africa. I was fighting to survive, fighting to stay sane in a world that had turned upside down. The desert had already taken so much from us, and we were about to give it more. The morning came far too quickly. We had no idea what to expect. The British were waiting for us, their guns trained on the horizon. The air was thick with anticipation, and as the sun rose over the endless dunes, I knew that today we would either break the British defences or become part of the desert ourselves. June 1941, Tobruk, Libya. We attacked at dawn, our tanks rolling forward, engines growling as they kicked up clouds of dust behind them. The air was already thick with heat, the sun beating down on us like a hammer. It was hard to see beyond the haze. The roads were narrow, twisted between jagged rocks, and our tanks struggled to keep their footing on the uneven ground. Chapter 4. The Siege of Tobruk. The British had been preparing for us. We had underestimated them, and now we were paying the price. Tobruk wasn't a city, it was a fortress. From the moment we crossed the line into its perimeter, it felt like we were stepping into the mouth of a beast that had been waiting for us patiently for months. The desert had already taken so much from us, but now it felt like the real war was beginning. The first sign of trouble came too quickly. The British had set up anti-tank guns along the ridge lines, and as soon as we approached, they opened fire. The sound of the shots was deafening, followed by the screeching, gut-wrenching noise of a shell tearing through the air. A shell exploded just in front of our tank, sending shrapnel flying in every direction. The impact shook the entire vehicle, and for a moment, everything went still. The engine sputtered, then roared back to life, but the damage was done. We were pinned down, and it wasn't long before the British were on us, their artillery raining down from all sides. Tobruk wasn't just defended from the outside. No, it was protected from every angle. The British had turned the town into a fortress, a place they would die to defend, and we had no choice but to try and break through. We were ready, or so we thought. The first time we saw the defences, it was like a slap in the face. Barbed wire tangled in the distance, thick with dust. Mines littered the ground, their hidden jaws waiting to snap shut on anything that dared to tread too closely. There were trenches dug deep into the earth and gun emplacements that poked up from the sand like dark, hungry eyes. And in the distance you could hear the steady rhythm of British artillery, their guns firing relentlessly at any movement on the horizon. There was no cover, no place to hide. The desert had given us nothing to work with but sand and rocks, and those were only obstacles in the face of the enemy's fire. We had the advantage of mobility, yes, but the British had something else: position. They were dug in, and every move we made was met with resistance. The air smelled like fire and dust. The ground shook with every explosion, and I could feel it in my chest as though the earth itself was trying to reject us. We fought back, of course. We had no choice. But it wasn't the kind of battle where you feel like you're in control. It was chaos. The British were everywhere, hiding behind rocks, in dugouts, inside the walls of the fortress. They fired from every direction, their gunfire sharp and precise, while we tried to push forward, trying to break through their lines. I don't know how long we fought. Hours, maybe. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the heat only seemed to grow more unbearable. My uniform was soaked with sweat, the fabric sticking to my skin, and my throat was dry, too dry. I was aware of the hunger gnawing at me, but I couldn't think about that now. The fight was everything. We had no choice but to keep moving. I remember the first time I saw one of our tanks fall under enemy fire. It wasn't as dramatic as I'd imagined it would be. There was no explosion of flames, no dramatic collapse. It was just sudden. One moment, the tank was there, moving forward, and the next, it was motionless. Smoke billowed from the turret, and the crew was nowhere to be seen. I later learned that they had been hit directly in the engine, and the crew had no chance. The tank, now nothing but scrap metal, was left to burn under the relentless sun. I lost count of the number of men we lost during that assault. By the time the first day came to an end, the battlefield was littered with the remains of destroyed tanks, shattered equipment, and the bodies of soldiers who had paid the price for our push. The land around us had become a graveyard, and the closer we got to the walls of Tobruk, the heavier the weight of our losses became. Every step forward felt like it was measured in lives. We were digging our own graves with each advance. The sound of machine gun fire echoed in my ears as I squeezed the trigger of my own weapon, firing back at anything that moved. Every time we thought we had the upper hand, we were forced back again. The British had fortified the city so thoroughly that it felt impossible to break through. We had the numbers, we had the tanks, but they had the ground, and that ground was soaked in blood, ours and theirs. As we pushed closer to Tobruk, we found ourselves tangled in a labyrinth of trenches and dugouts. The British soldiers were dug in deep, and every time we thought we had cleared an area, there were more of them, hidden just beyond the next rise, waiting for us. Their tactics were simple, but effective. They were like shadows in the sand, appearing out of nowhere, firing and retreating before we had time to respond. We didn't give up, though. We couldn't. The orders were clear: take the town. We kept pressing, even though we knew the odds were against us. The British weren't going to give up easily. They fought with everything they had, and they knew the land better than we ever would. By the end of the second day, we had barely made any ground. The British counterattacked with ferocity, pushing us back from our hard-won positions. The sense of frustration was overwhelming. We were surrounded, and every attempt to break through was met with more resistance. It was as if Tobruk had become an impenetrable wall, a barrier that we couldn't overcome. We retreated for the night, our tanks damaged, our morale shattered. The silence that fell over us was suffocating. We were soldiers, yes, but we were also human, and the weight of the battle had begun to crush us. The desert had become our prison, and Tobruk our cage. I sat in the sand that night, the heat of the day still radiating from the earth, and I thought about home again. It felt like a distant memory. The world before the war had faded into something unrecognizable, like a dream I could no longer reach. Because in the desert you don't get second chances. You either win or you die, and we weren't ready to die just yet. We were still far from victory. Tobruk was a fortress, and we were only at the beginning of what would be a long, grueling siege. There was no easy way out of this, and I knew it. But we had come this far. We had to push forward, even if it meant losing everything. July 1941, Tobruk, Libya. Chapter 5. The cost of holding the line. The days began to blur together. The sound of artillery became a constant companion. Every day, our tanks rumbled forward, taking positions near the outer perimeter of the city, only to be met with heavy resistance. We were always on the move, always dodging the British artillery or their well-positioned machine guns. They had no intention of letting us break through. They had turned Tobruk into a fortress, and every inch of ground we took was paid for in blood. There were no clear markers of time in the desert. Each day felt like a repetition of the last sweat, dust, gunfire, explosions, and the endless, suffocating heat. The sun, always relentless, blazed down from a sky that seemed too blue, too indifferent to the hell unfolding below. The British were still dug in, still fighting with everything they had. The battle for Tobruk had become something more than just a military engagement. It had turned into a brutal test of endurance, a test that we were starting to fail. I can still feel the weight of the heat pressing down on me as we prepared for another assault. My uniform was caked in dust, my skin burned and blistered from the sun. The air tasted like ash, and my mouth was constantly dry, no matter how much water I drank. I had long stopped being hungry. It was too hot to think about food. The only thing that mattered was the next step, the next battle, the next fight. We began our attack on the eastern side of the fortress. Our tanks rolled forward, engines growling, the heavy metal moving slowly but surely across the rough terrain. The British weren't caught by surprise. They had been waiting for us. They opened fire almost immediately, their artillery smashing into the earth, sending clouds of dirt into the air, the blast sending shockwaves through the ground. The British, though battered, never seemed to break. They were like a brick wall, unyielding, each man determined to hold the line. But we were determined too. The orders were clear: take Tobruk at all costs. Our commanders told us that the town was crucial. It was a point of control that would help us push forward into Egypt, securing our hold on North Africa. But at times, in the midst of the smoke and the fire, I wondered how many more lives we would lose before we succeeded. I was in the front line again. The tank's turret spun as we searched for targets. We were closing in on an anti-tank gun position, but the British fired first. A shell slammed into the side of the tank, and the metal groaned with the impact. The blast knocked me off balance, and for a split second, I couldn't hear anything but the ringing in my ears. The world seemed to slow down, and I felt as though I were in a dream, suspended between the blast and the shock that followed. The tank crew quickly recovered, adrenaline kicking in. The engine roared back to life, and we fired back. The fire from the British gun positions was intense, but we managed to return fire with our own artillery. The ground erupted again with the force of an explosion, and another tank went down, flames licking the air as the crew scrambled to escape. It was a grim reality. We were learning to live with the tanks were strong, but they weren't invincible. Every tank lost was a blow, and every blow made it harder to keep going. The British were methodical, precise in their defense. They didn't take unnecessary risks. They let us come, drawing us into their prepared positions, where they had the advantage. It was like a game of chess, and we were the pawns, always moving into the positions they had already planned for. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into their trap. We fought for hours, pushing forward, inching closer to our goal. The heat, the dust, the noise, it all became a blur. There was no thinking about tactics anymore. It was just survival. Every movement was automatic: duck behind cover, fire the weapon, reload and keep moving. My hands were trembling from the constant tension, and I had trouble remembering when I had last rested. But there was no time for that. We had to keep pressing. I lost track of time. The battle stretched out before us, and it felt like we had been fighting for days without stopping. We'd capture a position, only for the British to counterattack and take it back. The hours became a cacophony of gunfire, explosions, and shouts. It was impossible to hear yourself think, impossible to remember why we were even fighting anymore. We were too far into this nightmare to back out. I sat with the rest of my crew for a moment, my body aching, my mind numb. I thought about the men we had lost. We had seen the British as the enemy, but now, after so much bloodshed, they were more than that. They were soldiers, just like us, fighting for their own survival. The lines between us had blurred. The enemy, the terrain, the endless push, it all felt the same. We were just men now, caught in a war that had no end in sight. As the day wore on, our losses mounted. The field was littered with the remains of destroyed vehicles, both ours and the British. The smoke hung heavy in the air, the smell of burning metal and flesh seeping into everything. It was hard to tell who was winning, but it didn't matter. We had to keep fighting, or else we would be the ones to lose. I remember watching as the men around me began to dig into the sand, preparing for the next day's assault. There was no time to rest. The night was brief, and when the sun came up, the battle would resume. There would be no mercy. There would be no break. And yet we couldn't stop. We had to keep moving forward. Tobruk was still ahead of us, its walls standing tall, unyielding. But we would fight for it. We would die for it, if necessary. And we hoped that, one day, it would be enough. By the evening we had gained a small portion of ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. The British had pulled back to reorganize, and for a brief moment we had a chance to breathe. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the desert in deep reds and oranges, but there was no peace in the fading light. We were still here, and so were they. The battle for Tobruk would not end with the setting of the sun. Because that was what soldiers did. We fought. We held the line. The sound of artillery never leaves you. Chapter 6. The struggle for survival. The heat was unbearable. It clung to your skin like a second layer, suffocating, making every movement feel like a chore. Even the simplest tasks were exhausting. Every morning when the sun first rose, there was a brief, blessed respite from the worst of the heat. But that didn't last long. The day's heat soon became a furnace, burning everything in its path, and we were all feeling the toll of it. But it wasn't just the British that were wearing us down, it was the desert itself. Every day we'd advance a few hundred yards, only to find that the ground ahead was just as barren and treacherous as the ground we'd already crossed. It seemed like the more we fought, the more we lost. It wasn't a war of victories and defeats, it was a war of attrition. And each day we were losing more than we were gaining. August 1941, Tobruk, Libya. We had been in Tobruk for over a month now, and the situation hadn't improved. The British were still holding their positions with determination, and we were still pushing against them, fighting for every inch. It had become a battle not just for the city, but for something much deeper, a struggle for survival, for sanity, for the will to keep fighting when everything else had begun to break down. It isn't just the thunder of the blasts or the crack of the shells that fills your ears, it's the silence in between, the waiting, the anticipation. The moments before the explosions when you know they're coming, but you don't know where or when. The earth trembles beneath your feet as if it's alive, and for that fleeting instant, you wonder if you're actually part of the land now. The desert doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about your orders, your mission, or your dreams. It's a relentless, unforgiving place, and every step you take deeper into it makes you question whether you'll ever leave. The British weren't making it easy for us. They had settled in for the long haul, and it showed. Their positions were well fortified, and they knew this land better than we ever could. They had their own tanks, their own artillery, their own machine guns, and they were all positioned to make our lives hell. It was like they knew every move we would make before we made it, and each time we advanced they pushed back. The tanks, once shining beacons of power, had become nothing more than ovens on wheels. The heat inside them was unbearable, and the constant vibrations rattled our bones. The gunmetal interiors felt like they were pressing down on us, suffocating us. Even when we weren't in combat, the tanks were oppressive, a constant reminder of how close death was. Every time we crossed into new territory, I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for our luck to run out. How long before one of our tanks was taken out? How long before we were next? I watched as another of our tanks was hit. The shell struck its side, a bright flash of fire that seemed to stop everything around it for a moment. I held my breath, waiting for the crew to bail out, but the tank never moved. The fire spread quickly, and within seconds, the tank was engulfed in flames. I could see the crew inside, trapped, helpless. There was nothing anyone could do. We couldn't stop for long. If we did, the British would come after us. If we didn't press forward, they would regroup, and we'd lose the advantage. So we kept moving, despite the fear, despite the losses. The desert didn't care about our fears. It just wanted us to keep going, to keep pushing until there was nothing left. I sat alone, leaning against a rock, watching the stars. They seemed so distant, so peaceful, so far removed from the chaos we were living through. For a few moments, I allowed myself to forget about the battle, to forget about the men we had lost, and the ones we might still lose. It felt like a lifetime ago that I had been back home, before the war had taken everything from me. I remember one of the nights we spent on the edge of the city, just outside the range of enemy artillery. It was cooler, and we had a chance to rest, if only for a short while. The air was still thick with the remnants of the day's dust and smoke, but the quiet was almost peaceful. There, in the dark, it almost felt like a time before the war. A sudden explosion rattled the ground, snapping me back to reality. The sound of distant gunfire joined the chorus. The British had launched another attack. We scrambled to our positions, and within moments the silence was gone. There was only the thunder of the battlefield, the sounds of shells whistling through the air, the crack of rifle fire, and the screams of the wounded. The fighting in Tobruk had turned into something brutal and unrelenting. It wasn't about strategy anymore, it was about holding on. Holding on through the endless hours of gunfire, through the heat, the fear, and the exhaustion. We were in the trenches now, just like the soldiers of old, waiting, praying for the next order, for the next move, for the next chance to survive. But that peace didn't last long. By the time we were halfway through August, the mental toll had started to become unbearable. Every day felt like the last, and every night was filled with dreams of death. I would close my eyes, but all I could see were the faces of the men we had lost. The faces of the men who had once been beside me, fighting for something that felt so distant now. Were they still there in the world we had come from? Or had they too become part of the desert? I thought of home often, especially at night when the battle subsided. It was always the same memory that haunted me: my family, my mother, my younger brother, the quiet evenings by the fire, the simple days before all of this had started. It seemed like someone else's life, like it was part of a story I had read and forgotten. Could I ever return to it? Would there be anything left of me when this was over? But there was no room for that kind of thinking. Not in the middle of a siege. I had a job to do. We all did. The days wore on, and the battle for Tobruk showed no signs of letting up. Each side fought for control of the town, but each time we took a step forward, we were pushed back. The cycle of attack and counterattack repeated itself again and again. The days began to feel like weeks, and the weight of it all hung heavily on my shoulders. Tobruk was no longer a battle for a city. It was a fight for survival, and as the battle raged on, it became clearer that the desert was not our greatest enemy. The real battle was against our own bodies, our own minds. How much longer could we last? How much longer could we endure? But there was no choice. We had to keep going, because as long as we fought, there was a chance, a small, fading chance that we could win. And that was enough to keep us going one more day, one more step.